So you mentioned Keith Campbell. So the next question is around influences. I imagine he was a strong influence on you, but so maybe you could talk about that, but then other important people that influenced your direction.
Yeah, well, I think Keith was probably the most important influence in terms of driving what I did as an academic, basically. I mean, he was a pretty tough taskmaster.
Yeah.
I remember he and I went to the International Association conference in Kenya in 1976. Must have been August 76, and he had a draft of my PhD thesis, and I got an attack of appendicitis on this trip.
What a place to get it.
Yeah, it wasn't very pleasant really, and I was really not in a very healthy way, and on the way home, and in those days it was also a long tortuous flight to get out of Kenya and get home, and Keith was there with my PhD, and he always marked up everything in pencil. Mm-hmm. And the weight of I reckon the weight of the graphite on the draft was heavier than the actual draft itself.
Yeah, right.
I mean, it's just, you would not believe how much effort he'd put in, and he'd keep coming back and talking to me about what terrible stuff I'd written in this thesis, and I was sort of dying of appendicitis, and he's lecturing me about what should have been happening, basically. So, that
very focused individual
sticks in my mind as a pretty telling sort of experience.
So maybe just a little bit more on your University of Sydney days in the period when you were leading the department. What do you remember about those days? So the personalities, the people who were there, the main events.
Well, I suppose the biggest personality in ag economics, in terms of sort of being larger than life, was Bruce Davidson. And I guess everybody who encountered Bruce remembers the tendency to pace back and forwards when he was giving a lecture or giving a talk. I mean, he basically just could not stand still, basically. He had to be moving. And that was one of the things that sticks, I think, in everybody's mind. And I suppose the other thing that's, he taught farm management at the department in Sydney, and he insisted on drilling into everybody the fundamentals, basically. So I think from that perspective, he had a very strong influence on getting people the right grounding in the principles of farm management.
Yes.
Okay. Now, farm management never struck me as a terribly interesting topic, but Bruce loved it, basically, and drove the process. And that, together with John Longworth's farm management game, and I don't know whether you've had much to do with that, but in the early days, that was sort of an innovative approach to teaching farm management. So I think those guys actually had a big influence on the way in which students came at farm management at the University of Sydney.
Yes. Okay. So from Sydney, what was the prompt for you to leave Sydney and move on?
It must have been about 1986 or thereabouts. I became the Dean of the faculty, and as part of, and there had been a long debate about whether we needed to reform the Bachelor of Science in Agriculture and bring it more into the 20th century. Yeah. And there was an enormous debate about that in the faculty, and I, as the dean, was sort of at the centre of this,
Yes.
potentially as the reformer, and then there were a bunch of people who believed that I was potentially going too far,
Yeah.
basically, and undermining what had been there for the last 55 years or something. So there was a lot of tension, a lot of tension. And these faculty meetings, anybody that's been to a faculty meeting probably understands exactly how frustrating they can be.
Yes.
Same as academic boards, basically. They're frustrating places, potentially. And after one of these very frustrating meetings, where it was becoming pretty obvious that we were going to have to increment the curriculum forward sort of almost half a syllable at a time.
Yeah.
I walked back from the faculty meeting, and as I walked into my office, the phone was ringing. And it was Jeff Miller, who was then the secretary of the Department of Primary Industries and Energy, on the phone saying, "Oh, have you wasted enough time as an academic? Why don't you come and run ABARE for me and do something useful first time in your life?" And I said, "Well, actually, Jeff, I'm prepared to consider that. You just let me know," and basically
That's what happened.
that's what happened. Yeah.
So how long were you at ABARE?
I was at ABARE for almost 18 years as the director.
Was it ABARES by the time you entered, or did that come later?
No, it was always ABARE,
Yeah.
the Australian Bureau of Agriculture and Resource Economics.
And what were some highlights in that phase?
Well, I suppose during the time I was there, I guess in terms of being attacked by a cat, in terms of agriculture, probably the most challenging time was the wool crisis.
Yeah.
And basically attempting to provide advice on the best way forward with an industry that was reasonably set in its ways about accepting any policy change, a government and a minister in John Kerrin who understood completely that something had to change,
Yes.
but stuck with the dilemma that the moment they moved, basically as a dominant player in the wool market, you have an impact around the globe on the entire market. So trying to work through the process of providing advice on how you disassemble something like the minimum reserve price scheme was tough work, basically.
Yeah.